Are we all equally sinful?
You mean just the panel, or...
Start with us. I mean, if you want to do me first, I'll volunteer. Degrees of sin, degrees of judgment, our condition.
Well, I'll say the easy thing. We're all equally guilty before the judgment of a holy God. You're either guilty or you're innocent. If you're guilty, you're guilty. And we're all equally guilty. Some of you may have read this rather fascinating novel, Gilead. Have you read that? The old minister in there, has concluded at the end of his pastoral ministry, and I'm turning this question now back on Don or anybody who wants to field it. But he has concluded there's a difference between honorable sinners and dishonorable sinners. And I found that a fascinating distinction. It resonated on some emotional level with me, but I wasn't sure theologically what I ought to make of that. So I'd like a theologian to prove himself to be somewhat useful.
I have noticed in recent months a lot of Christians walking around carrying Jerry Bridges' book, Respectable Sins. So there are a lot of folk respectably sinning out there. But the question was addressed to you, Don.
Was it? No, you see, you weren't listening. It wasn't, and you're doing very well. Keep going. Or maybe it was addressed to me because there's universal recognition that I'm the worst of sinners. I suppose if you want to think at a purely mechanical level, we can't all be equally bad, or Paul isn't telling the truth when he says he's the worst. I think actually there are two questions here that are sometimes confused. One is, are we all equally guilty before God, which is the question that Bob brought up. And then there are texts like, if you break the law at any point, you've broken the whole thing. If you break a mirror, you don't have to break every single piece in it to conclude that the mirror is broken. And in the light of the sheer heinousness of defying our Maker and Redeemer, any gradations in sin that you might talk of after that is small potatoes compared with the sheer heinousness of defying God. And in that sense, in sheer magnitude and volume and everything else, we're all equally guilty sinners. On the other hand, there are many, many texts that show there are differences in sins on several axes. The Old Testament distinguishes between sins committed with a high hand and those not committed with a high hand. When Jesus in Matthew 23:23 is talking about how tithing was scrupulously observed, he says, you tithe mint and cumin and whatever the third one was. Yeah. and this you ought to have done, but you've ignored the weightier matters of law, justice, and mercy, of love, justice, I'm tired, too many time zones, of justice, mercy, and truth. And as a result, he clearly sees that the breaking of the one is more significant in some ways than the breaking of the other. But he doesn't say, so forget about the first one, you can just focus on the bigger issues of mercy and forget the rest. He says, these you ought to have done and not to have ignored the other ones. And so there are clearly sins too for which you have to stop praying for people. It's bound up with the biblical notion of apostasy, just as Samuel is told to stop praying for Saul. So in 1 John 5, there comes a point where the apostle can say, I do not say you should pray for that sort of person. And thus, at the level of hardening of heart and different weights of things that Jesus himself gives, weightier and lighter matters of the law, then there are distinctions amongst sins. So you don't want to conclude from the true observation that we are all equally guilty before God, that all sins are equally significant or equally serious on every scale. If you start doing that, then you start trivializing moral discussion and start running up against a whole lot of other biblical texts.
Yeah, I guess for me, absolutely, I agree with this guy. But then I think I'd want to know contextually where the question is coming from. So if this is a question being asked in the context of the pastoral counseling setting, I'm right there with Don. I think I want to establish some distinctions so that I might treat and apply the situation appropriately. If it's a question arising out of an evangelistic context, for example, I might want to go the other way. Thinking of the scripture, my righteousness is as filthy rags before God. The word there is righteousness, not my sins. There's enough sin in my righteousness to condemn me before God. So I might want the whole world's mouth shut up in their guilt before God, and thus not want to draw fine distinctions between gradations of sin. So I think how you respond to that question in part depends upon what you're doing relative to that question.
That's good.
Thank you, brother.
Can I push that one stage farther? You see the same sort of thing in David's reflection on his sin in the matter of Bathsheba and Uriah the Hittite and so on. In Psalm 51 when he says, "Against you only have I sinned and done this evil in your sight." And at one level, of course, that is a lot of poppycock. I mean, he has sinned against Bathsheba. He seduced her. He sinned against Uriah. He had him bumped off. He sinned against the military high command. He corrupted them. He sinned against his family. He betrayed them. He sinned against the nation. It's hard to think of anybody he didn't sin against. And yet, when he says, "Against you only have I sinned and done this evil in your sight," it is a profound insight. Because what makes sin, what makes it so heinous, what makes it so immeasurably vile, is precisely that it defiles God, it de-gods God, it ungods God, as it were, in our own hearts and minds. And that means that whenever we sin, whether it's cheating on our income tax or cheating on our spouse or nurturing bitterness, the person who is always most offended is God himself. And until Christians see that, and see that moral discussion has to be framed, first of all, within that place, then it is premature to talk about gradations of sin. But once they have seen it, then there is a place for other kinds of discussion.